Hakika wema nazo fadhili, hakika wema nazo fadhili, hakika.
Welcome to Moveable Dough. This is Steve Danielson. Each week, I get to sit down with a living composer and talk about their lives, their musical journeys, and of course, their music. Join me and take a peek inside the mind of a composer. For a complete archive of episodes, as well as access to the shorter segments called Movable Snippets, visit my website, sdcompose.com/moveabledough. Hey, this is Steve. Thanks for joining me for this episode of Moveable Dough. My guest today is Dr. Reena Esmail. Reena is an Indian-American composer who works between the worlds of Indian and Western classical music. She holds degrees in music composition from Juilliard and Yale School of Music. She received a Fulbright Nehru grant to study Hindustani music in India. Reena's works have been commissioned by ensembles including the Los Angeles Master Chorale, Kronos Quartet, Richmond Symphony, San Francisco Girls Chorus, Albany Symphony, and many more. She was the Seattle Symphony's composer-in-residence for 2020 to 2021 and is the Los Angeles Master Chorale Swan Family Artist-in-Residence. Reena Esmail, welcome to Moveable Dough.
Thank you so much. It's so great to be here.
So, Reena, I know you live in Los Angeles now. Did you grow up in that area?
I actually did. I grew up in Los Angeles. I lived here until I was 18, and then I moved back. I was away for 13 years and then moved back home. So I'm living in my hometown.
Oh, very nice. So did you grow up in a musical family? Were your parents encouraging music?
You know, it's funny, not at all. There's no one in my family who is a professional musician. We have a dancer just in my extended family, but otherwise, I think people were really musical, you know, but certainly my mom grew up in Kenya, my dad grew up in Pakistan, and those were not places where you made a career as a musician, so
right.
It would have been hard to know whether there were generations of my family who maybe could have, and I think maybe the grandfather on my mom's side definitely could have made a career in music if circumstances had been different. But yeah.
Was he a singer or what was he doing?
It was interesting. He loved Western classical music. So my mom comes from a part of India that was colonized by Portugal. It's Goa. And so she was raised on Western classical music. And my grandfather would play these records of Beethoven symphonies for her. You know, when she lived in New Zealand for her own school, she heard Arthur Rubinstein play live. And, you know, it's really incredible because she had a love for classical music because of her father for a really long time.
So what about you? Where did you start? Were you doing piano lessons or choir or band, or what were you doing?
Yeah, so when I started in music, and I think, you know, if you look back at my trajectory, it was very clear that I was a musical kid, and my mom would see that I would ask her to repeat nursery rhymes until I had memorized them, and then I would sing the same tune and change the words, and then sing the words and change the tune. All these things that are obvious composer traits, but of course my parents just thought, oh, that's every kid just does that. That's fine. But I started in guitar lessons, and I loved playing the guitar. I thought that was really cool. I started when I was 8, and then from there I played a little bit of violin, and really then got serious about piano when I was 11. And got pretty serious right away and just practiced for many hours and really had the idea that I wanted to become a pianist. Obviously, I'm not a pianist now, but that the piano is still the instrument that is my primary instrument.
Gotcha. So I know you went to a performing arts high school. So did you know at that point already that you wanted to make a career path in music? Or what was your trajectory? What did you want to become?
So it was interesting because I was going to an all-girls prep school called Marlboro in Los Angeles. And it was a really awesome school. I was there with all my friends. And I remember just having heard the word Juilliard in my mind. And like a kid with stars in my eyes, I'm like, that seems like an important place. I want to go there. So my parents took me to Juilliard to see what it was all about and to get a tour. And when I looked at the audition requirements, I said, oh my God, if I want to get into this school, I have to change my life. Like, there are people who are way ahead of where I am. And so I left the private school that I was at and chose to go to an arts high school from 10th grade to 12th grade to actually begin that journey of having the time I needed to practice to get good enough at piano. But then it was really funny because the minute I landed up at this arts high school, my theory teachers immediately saw the composer traits in me and said, you know what, we think you should take this class in composition. This might be the right fit for you. And it just moved very, very quickly from there.
Very interesting. So you were starting composing even in the high school where you were. Were you composing for the ensembles there, or what were you doing?
So the comp studio would bring in different people, and they were professionals around LA. That's one of the great things about growing up in LA. There's always amazing musicians who are just around who do all kinds of things. And so we'd have ensembles come in and they would read our pieces. And it was really only probably the last year, my senior year of high school, that I was really serious about the idea of composing. And even then, when I was in college, or when I was applying to college, I basically wanted to apply as a pianist. And the teachers were like, hey, you're already applying for piano. Why don't you also apply for composition? I had written 2 pieces. I sent them off. And I mean, it was amazing because I was getting calls for composition way before I was getting calls for piano. And that, you see, especially as a high schooler auditioning for schools, you're kind of trying to see where you meet the world. And I was realizing that the world was meeting me more in a place for composition than it was for piano. And so in a way, I just followed that resonance.
Uh-huh. So when you were growing up, were you listening to Hindustani music as well as Western music? Was that part of your upbringing as well?
So no, what's really interesting is that, as I mentioned, my mom was kind of listening to Western classical music. And then my dad didn't have that much music in his family. And so I really only grew up knowing that Western music was the kind of music that was really what I knew about classical music. And outside of that, I definitely listened to a lot of kind of singer-songwriters. My friends' parents were into Joni Mitchell and stuff, and Barbra Streisand. And those were the kinds of things that I listened to that were outside of Western classical music. And I think I was aware that India had a musical tradition, but because no one in my family knew much about it, and I was certainly one of very few South Asian kids who was going to the schools that I was going to, I had no one to introduce me to those things until much later in my life.
Mm-hmm. So I know you studied it quite intensely, and it sort of culminated with your doctoral thesis, which I want to go to. So Finding Common Ground, Uniting Practices in Hindustani and Western Art Musicians. So it explores the methods and challenges of the collaboration between Hindustani musicians and Western composers. So give me your elevator speech about this topic. What's the biggest challenge that these two groups face, and what sort of solutions do you have?
Basically, I would say that if you go back historically, when Western classical music started being notated, that's when it separated from a lot of other musical traditions. And so Hindustani music has stayed primarily an oral art form. So you learn it by rote, you learn by repeating things back to your teacher. And Hindustani musicians are essentially improvisers. And I like to say that sometimes with Western classical music, let's say like 95% of it is written, and that last 5%, after the notes and rhythms and the score, everything that's in the score is interpreted, then you can kind of put your own spin on it. In Hindustani music, it's maybe only 2 to 5% that's the same, and then you're building things from those very wide scaffoldings. And so how do you bring together musicians that have A, never improvise, and B, only improvise? Right. And so you can imagine all the things that happen there. And, just obviously like in a rehearsal, when someone is not able to, when someone stops and then they're like, okay, we're going to take this from measure 35. What does that mean if you don't have a sense of things, And even things like, the difference between Hindustani musicians sitting on the floor, Western musicians sitting in chairs, the sight lines, the communication where a Western musician is looking at a stand and a Hindustani musician is looking at the Western musician trying to figure out why they're not looking back at the same rate. And so all these things are just, almost human challenges. And I love that fact. I love that there's just these challenges of basic communication. But once those challenges are surmounted, And once people find a way to communicate with one another, and it really is individual to individual, they're able to build a relationship that's really unique and not prescribed as it is in Western music. Okay, I'm a violist. I know this is my job in this orchestra. This is what I do. They get to take a step outside of that and be like, who am I when I'm communicating with someone across cultures? It brings out something different in me.
So perhaps you'll talk about this later when we get to your pieces, but when you're writing for these two groups simultaneously, how do you approach that? I mean, you've got this very sort of notated Western notation that we are so used to, and yet you have the improvisers along with it. How do you deal with that?
That's been the last decade of my life, honestly, is figuring out how that works. Because what has to happen is that each group has to see something that they recognize in the other group. But it's almost like they don't necessarily know that what the markers are of each other's tradition, but I have to know what the markers are of both traditions. So for example, there's this rhythmic device called the tihai, where something is repeated 3 times in Hindustani music, and it's done in this phrase is repeated in a very specific way, where a Hindustani musician can immediately hear, okay, this is where something is going to align. I know where it's going to be. I know when it's coming. I know to look for it. So if I write that out for a Western musician, a Hindustani musician immediately will hear it. And then on the other hand, sometimes I know a Hindustani musician is going to have basically a certain trajectory or work within a certain set of pitches, and I'll write the Western musician's parts so that I know basically whatever the Hindustani musician improvises will go along with what I need. And so then it's a matter of kind of dialing up and dialing back, because I can say to the Western musicians, hey, I want you to try this phrase and put this ornamentation on it that you wouldn't normally do, and I want you to listen to what the Hindustani musician is doing, and then kind of take your interpretation from that. And then on the other hand, sometimes I put something in the Western musician part and I'll say to the Hindustani musician, okay, I want you to just listen to what the Western musician is doing and then improvise off of that. So it's almost like, the cultures there's always kind of a space between these two musical cultures, and I occupy that space and I make it smaller and smaller and smaller until I can kind of grab their hands and just connect them to one another, and then let them go and let them fly.
Oh, that's really cool. So I'm curious, do you have a favorite time period of Western art music? Are you like an early music buff or an atonal aficionado? I mean, what floats your boat in Western music?
Well, it's interesting because I think both sides of the common practice era are really interesting to me. Like kind of the Baroque side, and specifically, I mean, who doesn't love Bach? But I also feel like Scarlatti is someone that just makes me so happy, because I feel like there's such color and there's such use of so many different musical influences in his work, and I think that's really inspiring to me. And then on the other hand, things like Impressionism, the kind of textures and colors that are used there are also really inspiring to me. So it's kind of on either side, and I love the stuff in the middle. I love the romantic stuff. I love the classical stuff, but what are the things that really kind of spark me are those two sides.
Yeah, that's cool. So sort of going along that thread, do you have, I'm uninitiated in Hindustani music. I've tried to do some research preparing for this, but do you have a favorite stylistic feature of Hindustani music that you love to use? I know about ragas and talas, but I don't even know enough about them to really speak about them.
Well, but I love that you're engaging it even when you're not sure about things, because that's what I love. Is I love that people will meet me wherever they are, and like someone doesn't have to be an expert in Hindustani music to meet me. That's why I'm here, right? To be on both sides. Like the Hindustani musicians will ask me the same things about Western music, and it's equally fun to answer those questions. In my case, so there are specific ragas. In Western music we have major and minor scales, and then we have modes. But in Hindustani music, there are so many different rags that you can learn from, and each one has a very specific way of navigating it, specific phrases that kind of work or don't work. And I would liken that to the way that we see the minor scale, where we all know, okay, sometimes a 7 is sharp, sometimes it's flat, sometimes we go up a certain way, and we know what feels right and wrong, and we kind of, it escapes theory a little bit. That's how most rag is. It has that kind of feel about it. And so you just learn by example. And so I certainly have rags. I've found that over the years, there are certain rags that I'll gravitate to for a year at a time. And so I've just been getting out of this phase of this amazing drag called Charokeshi, which is, it goes from 1 to 5 is major, and then from 5 up to 1 is natural minor. So it has these two sides to it. When you're on the lower side of 1, if you're on the 1, 7, 6, 5 side, it sounds minor. Then when you're on the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 side, it sounds major. And so to our Western ears, you can just mess with these things and mess with expectation in such an unusual way, but in such an organic way too, because these rags have been cultivated over years and years, and so you're not just inventing a system that you invented. You're working with something that's already so rich and already has so many possibilities, and just picking out of it the things that feel maybe like they would be resonant to different ears.
So when you went to India to study this, were you was it taught to you in an oral tradition as well, or are these written down, or how did you go about learning them?
Yeah, I mean, I think it was really fascinating because a lot of my first exposure to Indian classical music was through other Indian singers, and specifically Indian women. And what drew me to the art was that, like I said, I wasn't seeing very many people who were South Asians in Western classical music. And so I was thinking to myself, okay, I know there are other South Asian women who share my culture who maybe are musicians. And I thought, okay, well, they just do a different kind of music, so I'm going to try to find that. And I think everything finally culminated when I went to Yale. And what was really interesting is they had a professor who was like a Western musician, but who taught Indian classical theory, who typically taught that class. And he wasn't available that semester, so they hired someone from India who knew nothing about Western music to teach the class. And something about that where I was like, oh, I don't have to use my Western music mind. I'm just one Indian woman learning from another Indian woman this art form. And it suddenly felt like I had this direct plumb line to my own culture in a way that I had never experienced before. And so that was a feeling that I was chasing, this feeling where even when I went to India, people were just kind of, the attitude was, they would look at me and they'd be like, look, we don't know what music you were doing before, but, it's great that you found your own cultural music. Come right in, let's learn this together. And because they believed that I would get it, I think I learned it faster because there was no sense that someone who had my DNA wouldn't be able to learn it. And of course, you can say that's definitely stereotyping in a weird way, but it certainly worked for me because I felt so accepted and so challenged in a way that people thought that I was able to handle it.
Sure. Well, you've had, over the years now, you've had commissions from some pretty amazing ensembles. So thinking back, can you remember a premiere or a performance of one of your pieces that is particularly memorable to you?
Wow. Well, I know we'll talk about this a little later, but definitely the premiere tour of This Love Between Us, my oratorio, was really a life-changing experience for me, because there were all these points in my life where I decided not to play it safe, and I decided I'm going to do something that I don't know how this is going to land. I don't know how this is going to go over. I feel a little bit out of my depth. And I'm asking musicians who I don't yet know to meet me and to trust me in this new experience. And what was amazing about the This Love Between Us tour is that it was the combination of all my musical education. So I did my undergrad at Juilliard, and it was the Juilliard historical performance program that played in the orchestra. And then I did all my graduate studies at Yale, and it was their choir, Schola Cantorum, that was the choir. And then the sitar and tabla player from India, where I did my Fulbright. And so I thought, wow, there are these three groups of people that I can bring together, and I have the unique understanding of how each of their systems work. And just having that moment on stage, it premiered at Alice Tully Hall in Lincoln Center in New York. And I remember just being on stage at that moment thinking, like, all these different threads of my life are finally finding their way together. And as a child growing up, I never thought that I would be able to experience that. And it was this moment of synthesis for me, for sure.
That's awesome. So I've got 2 more questions for you before we take a break. And these are non-music related, so we can get to know you a little bit more. What is one of your favorite books to read?
Oh, that's a really good question. There's so many great books. Well, I will say that right now, and I have to actually go through and read this again because it's such an amazing novel, but The Overstory, which is a book about, trees and the connection between nature and humans and the connections between us. That book is just an incredible piece of craft and something that kind of gets in your soul really deeply. And as a composer, I will say, understanding how that material came about just purely through my compositional mind, I mean, it is a work of complete genius.
The Overstory?
The Overstory by Richard Powers, I think.
I'll have to look that up. All right, last question. When you're not composing or you need a break, what sort of things do you like to do for fun?
Yeah, I'm trying to understand that myself. I'm kind of a workaholic. But we just moved to this lovely neighborhood in Los Angeles called Altadena, which is up in the mountains. And it's amazing because if you just walk behind our house, you can see these incredible, beautiful mountains. So we love taking our dog for walks up there and just kind of letting the world go, and being surrounded by nature is really incredible. And then I also think I'm really inspired just by people. I mean, there are so many great people who I have in my life, either in person or, across the country and world. And that's the amazing thing about being a musician, is you are just in these different communities and you get to have this large group of people who each bring out something different in you. So whenever I can, I always like catching up with friends too.
Fantastic. Well, I'm glad to be one of the people in your life.
Thanks.
All right, we're going to take a quick break, and when we come back, we're going to listen to some of Reena's compositions. Welcome back. I'm talking today with Reena Esmail. The first song that we're going to talk about today is The Tipping Point for SATB and Tabla, which, for those that don't know, are a set of hand drums that are essential for Hindustani rhythmic practice. So, first of all, The Tipping Point of what?
Yeah, so The Tipping Point is a title that was taken from this text by Amy Fogerson. And it's the tipping point of many things. Essentially, is the tipping point between darkness and light. And that works in a variety of ways. One is this idea of daybreak, that it's that beginning of the day between darkness and light. The other is this idea of the solstice, which is the tipping point in the year when it kind of tips back towards light. And the third was just a function of me writing the piece during a very dark point in the pandemic, and thinking that by the time the piece was premiered, maybe things would be better and the light would have returned, which indeed it did. It was better by the time the piece was premiered.
That's great. So how would you describe the relationship between the tabla player and the choir in this piece?
Yeah, so I think it was really interesting about this piece because it was the first time that I had really studied tabla myself. So my Hindustani training is as a vocalist. And so I definitely sing Hindustani music, so I'm very familiar with how that works in the voice. But I've not studied any percussion, not Western percussion and not Hindustani percussion. And I finally said to myself, okay, if I'm going to be writing for tabla, I really need to study it. So while I was writing The Tipping Point, I joined this tabla intensive that was happening with this wonderful tabla player, Sean Madovetsky, in Montreal. And I learned to actually really play tabla. And what was amazing is that I realized that sometimes I have to control the parameters of voice so tightly because, if you do a different note at a different time, harmonies can change and implications can change. But there's so much more improvisation that can take place and can be left up to the drummer in tabla playing that doesn't set off the balance of the piece at all. So I think in this case, the tabla player is someone who can really be pretty much Hindustani trained. And once the tabla player gets going and gets in a groove, they're left to their own devices to kind of respond in real time to the choir.
Fantastic. Well, we're going to listen now to The Tipping Point, here performed by the Santa Fe Desert Chorale with Joshua Haberman, conductor. All right, our next piece today is Tutarana for SATB a cappella choir. So this fast-paced piece uses rhythmic syllables combining the Hindustani musical form of tarana with the Western idea of tutti, choral singing. So can you elaborate more about writing this piece?
Yeah, so I wrote, this is one of my first piece that used these syllables. And I think a tarana is this solo art form where it's almost like a scat in jazz, where someone is kind of showing you their virtuosity by doing these syllables really quickly. And it's just incredible to watch people do that. And I always say, you know, when people are singing this piece, especially when young people are singing this piece, just look up like hashtag tarana on Instagram and see what comes up, because you'll be just bowled over by how amazing taranas actually are. So in this case, I wanted many people to get this idea of what it feels like to sing a tarana, because that feeling on the tip of your tongue when you're able to articulate these things really fast, it feels pretty amazing. And I know when we first had the performance of it, it looks terrifying on the page. I mean, in all honesty, most of my music looks really terrifying on the page because I'm trying to notate a tradition that was never traditionally notated. So right. Of course it's gonna look weird, but once you kind of get past that, you can kind of see that it's this thing where the faster you do it, the more excited you feel. So the choir started by going under tempo, and then by the time we were ready to record it, it was so far above tempo because people were so excited about it. So it's really, like, I love people singing. Bring it back. Yeah, like, no, go wild. I mean, if you can do it, by all means, whatever floats your boat.
So you do mention on your website how you thought differently about this piece during the Me Too movement. What was this change?
It was interesting because the elision of the words tutti and tarana are obviously, you know, what you described. But then I also realized that if you were to translate it differently, it translates to we are tarana, like we are all tarana, right? And tarana being Tarana Burke. I mean, if you pronounce it in a Western way, Tarana Burke, who was the founder of the Me Too movement. And I remember going for my my doctoral recital where they were going to perform to tarana, and being on the train on the way up to New Haven and just thinking, wow, that's a really different translation of that. And I mean, you know, I don't know what implication it has today or what that means, but I think there's something that's very empowering about the piece, whether it's just being able to do that and execute it, or about just the joy that it's supposed to bring to people. And and actually initially the piece was written for a women's chorus. Since then it's been, there's a brass quintet arrangement, there's an SATB arrangement. I mean, Iowa State, 600 kids are singing it for all state. It's super, super cool. But initially it was meant for women.
Cool. Well, here we go. We're going to listen to Tutarana, here performed by the University of North Texas University Singers with Lindsay Pope, conductor. right, we're going to turn next to Win the Violin for SATB and cello. So you talk about this piece as a companion to Victoria's Ovos Omnes. How do these two pieces pair together?
It was interesting because I was actually asked to pair the two pieces for the purpose of the commission. But the further that I get from it, the less I actually remember what the pairing was. And the more I kind of think about just the feeling of intimacy of Ovos Omnes. And that was something that I kind of built this piece out of. And this idea that, sometimes we feel like we need to be so strong and we need to be so infallible and we need to just, enter the world with the spirit of like wanting to fight. And there are also these moments where we need to be a little bit softer and we need to kind of let ourselves crack open and feel that vulnerability. And so in a way, Ovos Omnes made me feel that, and I wanted to convey that through Win the Violin.
So it's called Win the Violin, but originally scored for cello, as we're going to hear. So why cello and not violin?
That's a great question. And my husband, who is a violinist, is very angry about this. So it was actually a stipulation of the commission. And this is so funny because, when you look historically, you're like, well, why did Bach write this thing for this random combination of winds? And it's like, oh, it was just who was there at the time, and you're creative with whatever you're given. So in this case, it was like, well, a cellist is going to be here. And I was like, great, that sounds good. So, but I get asked that question a lot because there is now a version for violin and then there's another version for unaccompanied violin. And so people are like, where's the origin point of this, Yeah.
All right. Well, we are going to listen to this performance by the Los Angeles Master Chorale, Jenny Wong, conductor, and Cecilia Tson on cello. And our last piece today is This Love Between Us for SATB Choir, Baroque Orchestra, Sitar, and Tabla. The 7 movements of this piece are linked to the 7 major religion traditions of India and how each approaches the idea of unity. So first of all, what are the 7 major religions that you represent? And secondly, how did you approach each one differently musically?
Yeah, so in order of the piece, I don't know if I can do them in order of how big they are. I know Hinduism is number 1, but in order of the piece, they are Buddhism, Sikhism, Christianity, Zoroastrianism, Hinduism, Jainism, and then Islam. And specifically, I took Sufi Islam because it's considered blasphemous to set actual Islamic text to music. So I tried to avoid that and, respect the tradition. And it's interesting because I can't say that I really in every circumstance, used parts of that religious tradition to inspire the kind of musical setting that I did. A lot of it also depended on the language a little bit, because sometimes I feel Indian and words in Indian language is said a little bit differently than words in English, and that kind of informs then the entire piece. But certainly there is something about Christianity that's very like, here we are, like, we are Christians, you will know we are Christians by our love, that kind of thing. And I mean, I say this, I was raised Catholic, so certainly, I actually used my own, grandfather's Bible to that setting. I took it out of there. But yeah, there was one other situation where the Sikhism text I talked to someone who is Sikh and he actually helped me find the text, but then he was also kind of referring me to some Sikh music, and there was a bit of it that I just loved, and specifically there's this one little grace note that doesn't belong to the key but only appears as a grace note that was taken out of a Sikh and you say it's a grace note, can we even hear it? It really changes the fabric of the piece. So, yeah.
Oh, fabulous. So we're going to listen to the Jainism movement. Can you tell us anything about that particular one?
Yeah, so one thing that's really interesting and that those of you who know Jainism might be surprised by is that Jainism is considered this religion that's the most nonviolent religion. Like, even walking on the ground is like, maybe it's harming an ant that's walking there. And that's typically what people know about Jainism. But I found this text that was actually super fiery and is just like, hey, don't do these things that are bad. Like, just get them out of your life. And it's very prescriptive, but in a way that's so much more direct than you would think of Jainism as. But, yeah, so the texts are, and with every movement, it's set simultaneously in English and then in the vernacular, which obviously the exception is Christianity because there's no vernacular Christian text that's in Indian language. So I kind of reversed things there. But with Jainism, so it's set in English and in Ardha Magadhi, which is the original setting, the way the text originally appears. So the nice thing is that you can hear what the original language sounds like, and you can also simultaneously understand what they're saying if you speak English.
Fantastic. All right. Well, we are going to listen to Movement 6, Jainism. All right, Reena, what are you working on now that you can tell us about?
Ooh, so many things. Things have kind of all piled together after the pandemic. So if you just look at what's on my plate next, I'm just in the process of finishing an oboe and piano piece for the International Double Reed Society. I mean, I write probably equal parts choir music, orchestra music, and chamber music. So there's a lot in every category. After that, I'm working on finishing up an oratorio for Amherst College Choir with an amazing librettist poet named Rebecca Gale Howell. And, from there, I'm writing a third grade band piece for a group in Naperville. It's all over. And I'll end my year writing a massive half an hour long piece for LA Master Chorale. And then a combination of Hindustani soloists and Western soloists.
Fantastic. That sounds like a busy schedule.
It is.
So if my listeners want to learn more about you, where are you located online?
So it's super easy to find me. I'm the only Reena Esmail in the world that I know of. If you are another Reena Esmail, please get in touch. Let's talk. Reenaesmail.com. My Instagram is just at Reena Esmail. Those are the two best ways to reach me.
Fabulous. Well, hey, listeners out there, if you are enjoying today's episode, please share it with 2 of your friends. Let them know how much you enjoy Moveable Dough. If you enjoyed the past 4 seasons of episodes, please consider becoming a supporting member. For less than $1 a month, you can help me keep the music moving. Visit anchor.fm/moveabledough and click support. Well, Reena Esmail, thank you for joining me today on Moveable Dough.
Thanks so much for having me. This is wonderful.
My guest today was composer Dr. Reena Esmail. If you have a recommendation for a future guest or an idea for the show, please email me at moveabledough@gmail.com. This is Steve Danielson. Keep the music moving.